So I told the story about my granddad with the airplane, and he was very responsible for a lot of my love of cars and engines. The other half of my love in car and engines came from my other granddad, who was a motorcycle guy. Neither of my parents were into cars or planes or boats or anything, but I was very fortunate to have these two granddads that were just dyed in the wool gearheads, and they passed that love on to me. And this is some stories about my other granddad. When I was really young, like a baby, my parents, being young, new parents, were both working very hard. And the only place I really had available to me for daycare was my granddad in his motorcycle shop. That granddad, he worked on motorcycles, but he was also a photographer. And this is back in the 1970s. For any of y'all that either grew up in the 1970s or didn't grow up in the 1970s, it was a time of a much more casual approach to parenting and child safety. And as a result of that, as a literal baby, I'm climbing around in a motorcycle shop full of lifts and presses and welders and all kind of tools around. And I have some, pretty good memory, very visual memory. And I can certainly remember the sights and smells of this shop even as a baby. A lot of good times. And I remember this police scanner that my granddad had in his shop. And what he would do is, as a photographer, he'd be working on a bike and he'd listen to this police scanner. And if something went down on the scanner, I remember it had these little row of lights that just went back and forth, kind of like Kit and Knight Rider, go back and forth. And I'd watch them go. Anytime something happened that was photo worthy, he and any other photographer in the area, they would all rush to the scene, get a picture. And then whoever was the first photographer to get back to the newspaper with the photo, like they usually got to sell their photo and that made them some money. So he'd be working on a bike, I'd be playing in the floor, and that scanner would go off. And if it was something worthy, he would snatch me up. Now, he had a 1973 or 74 Norton Commando motorcycle. And it had a milk crate, like bungee corded to the back seat. And he would grab me up, and I had a little helmet. I've still got it somewhere, a little baby helmet. He would put that baby helmet on me, put me and the camera in the milk crate, and then just zoom off to wherever this event was. And it'd be some, a car accident or somebody famous coming through town or whatever photo noteworthy was going on in that town. And being on the motorcycle, and he raced motorcycles and he'd race boats and he was a very fast guy. He would just lane split and cut through cars and do all this kind of stuff and would get out to the event. And just, of course, again, nothing's going to happen to a baby in 1974 or 73. He'd just leave me in the milk crate, grab the camera, run up ahead, take a picture of whatever, decapitated bodies or what, car crash or whatever it was, and leave me in the milk crate. Of course, I'm okay. I'm sitting in the traffic jam. And he'd run back, throw the camera in the milk crate, and haul back into town. And we'd be sidewalks and splitting lanes, get between cars. And he'd get the newspaper and grab me on one arm, grab the camera, run inside. And he'd usually beat the other photographers back because he had the motorcycle. And he'd sell his photo. And then we'd go back to the shop and do some work. So we would do this on a regular basis. Throw me in the milk crate and take off and go take these pictures. And of course, my mom would just be furious. What mother, as a young mom, wants to get home and find out that her baby has been riding around in a motorcycle at high speeds, lane splitting, racing back from some car accident? But he was a confident rider. He raced. He was an accomplished racer. He would go and out in these sandy roads and go practice falling. He was very competent. And I know he never once occurred to him that he was taking a risk with his grandson. He knew what he was doing. And I had a helmet on, and what safer place than in a milk crate on the back of a Norton Commando racing through traffic. So he loved me very much. And I know he never meant to put me at risk, but I'm sure my mother didn't see it that way. But yet it continued. I don't remember much. I just remember being in the crate sometimes. And as I got bigger, of course, I didn't fit in the crate. And then he kind of retired from photography. So that stopped. And my mom changed jobs and he was no longer my daycare. His house was full of books about motorcycles. And, he had a lifetime subscription to Cycle World magazine, which years after he passed away was still coming to my grandmother. So every time I'd go visit her, she'd give me a big stack of these things. And I just read them cover to cover and just had this love of motorcycles that's lasted my entire life. And it certainly goes back to him. My grandmother would tell me stories about him and his friends, and they'd go out in just these empty country roads or factories, and they would make race tracks and they would set up cones and have their own little races. He raced at Daytona and places like that years later on his own, but he was just a die in the wool bike guy, and I remember as a kid just he'd crank one up. He'd be tuning in his shop. He'd crank it up. And of course, it was just loud as everything. But as a kid, I thought it was the most magical sound. And I love watching the spoke wheels and the smell of the grease and the oil and all these parts around. And nowadays, as an artist and a sculptor making my artwork out of engine parts, I think I'm still reaching back to that DNA nearly 50 years ago of sitting in that shop and looking at all those parts and playing with the gears on the floor and all the greasy tools. The floor jack in my shop to this day and my creeper are his old tools and creeper. And I use his tools to this day to work on my own truck, to work on the smuggler truck, to work on my Harley. A lot of the vehicles I've talked about have all been serviced with these tools that I inherited from him. But he did a lot of stuff for me. A lot of men back in those days, it was kind of before, I know Snap-on and Matco and those premium tool brands were around, but those weren't really accessible to your average shade tree mechanic. So, there were the Sears brand Craftsman guys and the whatever the other, Ace Hardware brand. Well, my granddad was a Kmart man and he liked Blackhawk. That was their house brand of tools. So on a pretty regular basis, we'd get in one of his cars or get on a motorcycle. We'd go to Kmart and he'd go get whatever tool he needed. And I still have a lot of these tools today. They're good tools. But he'd let me pick out a little Matchbox car, a Hot Wheel car. And I still have those. And I've been collecting them for many years. I have about 15,000 of them these days as an adult. But my whole Hot Wheel car collection started with that love of going with him, and he'd always let me pick one out. And I'd find the ones that had the doors opened or a little part moved. I always felt like I was getting like a little extra for my choice. So I treasure those cars very much, and I still have them to this day. He also gave me a book. It's a book by Richard Scarry called Cars and Trucks and Things That Go. And as a child, I learned to read when I was 2 and very early age, and largely because as I would go through those picture books, and it was just pictures of just every page was just all these cars going by, and it would be a racetrack or an airport or a harbor or a highway or something, and it would just say, sports car, dump truck, apple truck. It'd be like a bunch of little mice driving on a big banana car. It'd say banana car. And looking at those pictures, looking at those words, like really contributed to me learning to read so early. I literally just read that book until it fell apart. And I've since bought a vintage copy of it, and I have it at home right now. It's one of my very treasured possessions. And it was just all these cars and engines and planes and boats. And he would sit with me and read. My mom would do the same. She'd sit with me and read that book and just go through page after page. And there was a little bug on every page named Goldbug, and you'd look for the bug. And so that granddad just had a lot to do with my early love of cars and engines and all that sort of stuff. And he even taught me to count. He would sit me in his lap because it was the 70s and you didn't need seatbelts back then or baby seats or anything like that. He'd just put me in his lap and we'd go out and drive. And the numbers on the speedometer, we would count with those numbers, and I would call out a number, and he would accelerate to that speed, and he would ask me, okay, what's 10 more than that number, 10 less than that number? And I remember going over 100 many times. I learned to count to 100 when I was 2.5 years old because we were going faster and faster and faster, and I'd yell out numbers, and he'd do it, and we had so many irresponsible near-death experiences, I'm sure, but it was his love of me and his love of cars that carried on into my life to this day.
We'd like to thank Glossit for supporting the VINwiki channel this month, and right now Glossit is offering the best DIY ceramic coating package that we've ever seen or certainly offered here on VINwiki. For just $69.99, you're going to get their graphene ceramic coating along with the Real Difference Maker, their ceramic detail spray. Now that's a $50 bottle of spray detailer that I truly love just for daily use, but when you use that alongside their graphene ceramic coating, it makes the removal a lot easier, the outcome a lot smoother, you avoid high spots and things like that. So a DIY idiot like me in my own garage can achieve an outcome pretty similar to what Rich and his team were able to do last year on the Paris Hilton SLR, which I eventually torture tested on rallies and road trips and all this stuff, and it is now in Bulgaria, still looking wonderful. So check it out now at the link in the description below. There's a very limited quantity, so respond now and get yours for just $69.99. Thanks, Glossit.